Hello, welcome to the video. My name is S, and I am not a PC gamer. Ever since I was a kid, I have always played video games on consoles. This started way back when I was teeny tiny, when my uncle gave us his old Dreamcast, and transitioned into a GameCube, PlayStation 2, Nintendo Wii, and a bunch of the Nintendo handhelds. In 2016, for better or worse, I then joined the Xbox ecosystem, and the rest is history. I love gaming on console. It is comfortable, and I can do it from the comfort of my bed if I wish to, and it's just plain easy. Games work, and I don't have to think about it. However, that isn't to say that I don't like or don't want to be a PC gamer. By all accounts, PC gaming is technically the best way to game in terms of customizing your experience, being able to use mods, having the freedom of keyboard and mouse controls, and I'm actually very interested in PCs as a topic. I watch a lot of channels such as Linus Tech Tips and Random Gaming in HD because I just love technology and I love computing as a subject, alongside how PC builds can affect your experience with gaming. I've never made the transition to PC gaming for a few reasons, though primarily it's budgetary. I've just never quite had the ability to save for a nice PC setup before some event I want to attend happens, or Christmas rolls around, or birthdays, paying for car repairs. Don't get me wrong, I have prioritised having fun and giving my loved ones a good experience over getting a new PC, but that was my choice and I'm happy with that. But that leaves me with what I have in the meantime, and, well, it's starting to show its age. So let's get into it. This is my MSI Bravo 15. I bought this entry-level gaming laptop back in 2020, and boy has she been a trooper. Armed with a 120Hz screen, a Ryzen 7 4800H, 8 gigs of RAM running at 3200MHz, and an absolutely abysmal Radeon MX 5500M with a whole 4 gigs of VRAM. Even when it was brand new, this machine was not going to break records for speed. However, in daily use, it's pretty zippy for a machine that is half a decade old, even when I'm running multiple Chrome tabs and Discord and maybe even heavier software like Photoshop or Premiere. But it does sometimes hang or stutter or stop responding if I ask it to do a little too much, just like anything that's a little bit old and overwhelmed. So it must do great with gaming then, right? Well, to be honest, for the kind of stuff that I play, it actually does okay. My terrible old entry-level machine might just be the prime example that you don't really need the newest or the greatest or the most expensive to have a good time with a little bit of PC gaming. Older games like Skyrim and Left 4 Dead 2 run like an absolute dream, and many newer indie titles aren't exactly graphical powerhouses, so they also run absolutely fine. This means that games like Peak, for example, run really well, and that game was released earlier this year in 2025. But what if we tried to push it a little? With my laptop's specs, it's not really designed for much more than I've just described, but I've always wondered what it could do when pushed to its limits. So I've picked out a few games, some older, some newer, just to see how it does. The titles I've chosen are based on a few things. Firstly, availability. I don't have a huge PC library available, so the best I can do is use PC Game Pass and the small amount of games that I have available on Steam. Secondly, install size. My laptop only has 500 gigs of storage, of which about 150 gigs remains free. I currently don't own an external drive, and I don't really feel like buying one for a single video, so all of the games that I installed were under 100 gigs. Thirdly, my own personal interest. These are all games that I would be interested in playing, and performance depending, will either keep playing on my laptop, or I will have to delegate them to my trusty Xbox. With that in mind, let's get on to the games. For every game I played, I was playing at 1080p unless otherwise stated, and I was hoping to see frame rates of at least 60 frames per second. And the first game that I played was Minecraft. Minecraft is not a particularly graphically demanding game, as you can see from the multiple hundreds of frames that I had with the standard settings. But that's not what I was testing here. Everything can play Minecraft. I know that this laptop can play Minecraft, but I wanted to see if my laptop could run it with shaders. I enjoy the vanilla Minecraft experience personally, so I haven't really experimented with shaders before, so now feels like the right time. Once I got all of my mods in order, I installed the most popular shader pack that I could find and whacked the settings up, much to the behest of my laptop's fans. At 99% utilization, my little GPU did its best, but only is eking out about 30 frames. Impressive all things considered, but it does seem that fancy shaders are perhaps a little too much for this little machine. For some people, 30 frames might be considered entirely playable, but not for me. Hope is not lost, however. The good thing about Minecraft mods and shaders is often how customizable they are. It took very little effort to go into the shader settings and lower a thing or two to make the game run at a steady 50 to 60 frames a second, while still retaining a nice reshaded style. I'm not sure it's something that I would play with, but it's impressive to see that it can work, even on a machine with only 4 gigs of VRAM. Next up, I decided to try one of my personal favourites, team shooter Overwatch 2. Now, Overwatch 2 is technically a title that launched in 2023, however it acted more like a patch to the original Overwatch rather than a fully separate title. From this perspective, I don't really know how much they beefed up the graphics engine and other back-end parts of the game that would affect how hard it is to run. With the original game having been released in 2016, I figured my laptop had a fighting chance, and so when I got the game running, I wasn't surprised to see my little laptop run the game absolutely fine. What I wasn't expecting was to max out the settings and still receive a decent 60 to 70 frames per second. Granted, I am in the practice range here, so I imagine in a real match it might dip a little lower, but I am really impressed to see this. Naturally, the laptop fans were screaming at me, but I think that might just be par for the course at this rate. Overwatch is also the first game that I tried that had upscaling tech, and with a bit of help from that, the game sat at a happy 70 to 80 frames per second, which is more than playable. Although I do have to say the weird flickering you get from upscaling is a little bit distracting, especially in a game like this. But overall, very impressed. And then from esports to quite the opposite. We have Grounded 2. Grounded 2 is the sequel to the popular survival action-adventure game of the same name, and seeing as it's both new and in early access, I was very curious to see if my laptop would even stand a chance. To put it bluntly, no, it did not. Because I'm a sadist, I instantly maxed out the settings and let it put my laptop to work. The poor little 5500M in my MSI was just not up to the job, and despite its best efforts, averaged about 15 frames per second. Suffice to say, it was a bit of a slideshow. I then lowered the settings to not much avail, and with my MSI still heavily struggling, I decided to just drop the resolution to 16 by 900 and lower the render scale to 25%. The game looks like absolute garbage at this resolution, and for my efforts, I earned a measly 45 frames. I do actually want to explore this game, so I think for the time being this will be one to stay on my Xbox. I was really hoping the MSI would do a little better, but I definitely tried to make it punch above its weight with this one, so I think we'll let it off. Speaking of punching above its weight, and since I figured my laptop hasn't already suffered enough, I decided the next game on my roster would be Avowed. This early 2025 RPG has been on my radar for a moment, and since the install size was small enough, I figured what the hell. The installer did give me a warning that it recommended 16 gigs of RAM at a minimum, but clearly that sign didn't stop me. Unsurprisingly, the performance was not good. In fact, maybe even a little worse than Grounded. With the settings cranked, my MSI dragged itself along, handing out frames of around 10 per second. I tried upscaling, which made the game look absolutely abysmal, and was able to get around 20 frames a second with that. I decided then to be a little bit kinder to my laptop's poor GPU and cooling system, so I lowered the settings and found a somewhat steady 45 to 50 frames per second. Oddly, I found this to look a lot better than the 45 frames per second that Grounded 2 gave me, but that might be down to the frame timings as opposed to the frame rate itself. In a sense, I'm kind of impressed that I even got 45 frames per second, considering my laptop only has half the recommended RAM, though I do think the GPU is perhaps the bigger part of the bottleneck than anything else. Considering the graphical prowess of those last two games, I think my little laptop gave a valiant effort. It's certainly not built to be running these kinds of games, and the performance is evident of that. But the fact we got 40 frames on 8 gigs of pretty slow RAM and 4 gigs of half a decade old VRAM goes to show that not all hope is lost for low-end and budget builds. If my 5-year-old shit-tier MSI can nearly do it, then you can absolutely pull off 60 FPS gaming with not a lot much more. Which brings me to the final game of the video, Assassin's Creed Mirage. This was a recent addition to PC Game Pass, and it seemed like a good final game to try out, seeing as the AC games tend to be quite pretty and relatively dense. Mirage is also, fortunately, a rather small game, so the install size made it a no-brainer. I decided to jump in with the ultra settings and run the benchmark, and it crashed. I tried it a few times, and even tried loading into the game with the ultra settings, and my laptop just wasn't having it. For the few seconds of benchmark that I actually got, the frame rate was pretty inconsistent but seemed to round out at about 30 or so. But yeah, something about those ultra settings just wasn't agreeing with my little MSI. I decided then to show a little bit of mercy and moved down to the medium settings. I ran the benchmark again and we got a nice 55 to 60 FPS. There was a little bit of stuttering, however I did play the game regularly for a couple of minutes and it seemed to be perfectly fine there, so I'm not really sure what the issue was. In any case, it is definitely playable. So, whilst the higher settings seem to be impossible to even try to utilise, the game seems quite happy to run on this low-end machine. I say that's a bit of a win, and had I owned the newer game Assassin's Creed Shadows, I would have been interested to see how that performed in comparison. And with that, I decided that my laptop had been through quite enough testing and deserved a bit of a rest. All in all, I think that my 2020 MSI performed quite admirably. It's not going to give 4K 60 frames per second gaming by any means, nor is it going to be running the big-hitting, graphically intense titles of the current generation, unless you're dropping the settings a bit. But for something that was considered budget during its initial purchase, I'm rather impressed. It makes me feel like when I do eventually get around to getting myself a bigger, better PC, I don't actually need to shoot for the stars as much as I thought. And for now, I do have to keep a hold of this laptop, so I'm pretty happy to see how it's performing. Thank you so much for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed watching me make my laptop suffer. If you did, I'd greatly appreciate a like and a comment and a subscribe if you fancy. But if not, thanks again, and I hope to see you in the next one.